All right, welcome back to U.S. History Lecture Videos. I'm Mrs. Richardson. Today we're going to be talking about the Spanish-American War. So continuing to talk about the growth of the American Empire as we get into the early 20th century, late 19th century into the early 20th century. So by the end of today's lesson, you should be able to explain the origins and events of the Spanish-American War, analyze different American opinions on empire at the conclusion of that war, and describe how the Spanish-American War intersected with other American expansions. So the Spanish-American War marked a critical turning point when the United States transformed into a global empire. Why? The conflict only lasted 10 weeks, but it changed America's position in world affairs forever. Um, the Secretary of State at the time, John Hay, actually called it, quote, a splendid little war because of how quickly the U.S. achieved its goals. By the end of 1898, the world recognized the United States as a strong and formidable military power. So let's talk about things leading up to that. Cuba, the struggle for independence. So Spain had controlled Cuba and Puerto Rico since the late 1400s, but by 1890 they were Spain's only remaining American colonies in the America. Cuban independence fighters launched a movement to end Spanish rule, and in 1895 another revolt erupted and the Spanish general responded with brutal force. Spain's policy of reconcentration forced rebels from the countryside into military camps in cities where many died. American businessmen, right, how does it connect to America, especially in the sugar industry, supported Cuban independence to protect their own economic interests. Um, Jose Marti, founder of the Cuba Libre movement, established offices in New York and Florida to gain American support. Newspapers like the New York Journal and New York World competed for readers with sensational stories about Cuba. Yellow journalism used exaggeration and emotional language to influence public opinion towards military intervention. So newspapers stirred up American sympathy for Cuban rebels and a desire to use the new U.S. Navy to get involved. So the press, this is where we see the press beginning to play a major role in influencing American thought. They pushed Americans towards supporting a war with Spain. So this is where we get the beginning of a new conflict between America and Spain, specifically with the United States supporting Cuban independence against Spain trying to maintain Cuba as a colony. Okay. Now, the president was pretty hesitant to start a war, despite public pressure. He was worried that the fleet and soldiers were untested in real combat. They were still pretty new. He was also preparing for re-election in the year 1900 and wanted to avoid the risks of war. So in February 1898, he sent the USS Maine to Cuba to observe the situation and protect American citizens. But on February 15th of that same year, an explosion destroyed the ship, killing over 250 American soldiers. All right. Journalists immediately blamed Spain and created the battle cry, Remember the Maine. Modern historians believe the explosion was actually an accident caused by gunpowder stored near hot boilers, but without clear evidence, newspapers demanded war, blamed Spain, and all of a sudden the United States is even more motivated to go to war than they were before. The President McKinley made one last attempt to avoid war by demanding Spain end its reconcentration policy and calling on Spain to formally declare Cuba's independence. Spain refused, leaving him little choice but to ask Congress for declaration of war. In April of 1898, Congress officially recognized Cuba's independence and authorized military force to support them. Congress also passed the Teller Amendment, which promised that the United States would not annex Cuba after the war. Meant to reassure Americans who opposed expansionism and imperialism. We're not going to support Cuba just to take it after. We're supporting Cuba for our various foreign interests. So the war begins. The U.S. military had fewer than 30,000 soldiers and sailors who were unprepared, often, for combat. Over 1 million American men volunteered for service. Nearly 10,000 African American men also volunteered, despite facing segregation and harsh treatment. Now, the government struggled to feed and supply such a large force, and many soldiers suffered from malnutrition and malaria. The new Navy was powerful, but largely untested, and still had to learn how to work as a larger military, larger Navy and larger military. American military strategists viewed this as more than just a war to free Cuba. It was an opportunity to build an empire and establish naval bases across the Pacific Ocean. While Americans thought the war was about Cuba, military strategists planned for empire building. Assistant Secretary of the Navy Theodore Roosevelt ordered attacks on Spanish forces in the Philippines. The Philippines were another Spanish colony and offered strategic locations for Pacific naval bases. So we're looking at building a world empire, expanding beyond Cuba. American forces sank all of the Spanish ships in Manila Bay while taking almost no losses. So by the middle of August 1898, U.S. forces had captured Manila and the Spanish forces had surrendered, showing that America had a powerful navy capable of projecting force. So thinking big. Now back to Cuba. In June, 17,000 American troops landed in Cuba. Theodore Roosevelt led his Rough Riders, which was an all-volunteer cavalry unit of college graduates, cowboys, and veterans. He led a very famous charge up Kettle Hill, surrounded next to San Juan Hill, surrounded Spanish forces, and he surrounded Spanish forces. But his success depended heavily on the support of African American regiments. Might have been overlooked at the time, but we'd like to point that out now. Over 2,500 black soldiers provided crucial tactical support, and they were experienced veterans who had fought in the Indian Wars on American frontiers for years. One reporter actually wrote that without the black cavalry, the Rough Riders would have been destroyed. And so this brought honorable recognition to black soldiers in the military. Now, the decision for African Americans to serve in the military during the Spanish-American War. They faced discrimination at home. Some felt like they didn't owe anything to a country that wouldn't let them be full citizens. Others believed military service was a way for them to work their way up in the world. Black regiments faced racism, harsh treatment, right? Whatever challenges soldiers faced, black soldiers had it worse. But they often fought very bravely and earned recognition. And their service raised important questions in America about citizenship, loyalty, and equality. So it did bring attention to the issues of segregation and inequality. So this war continues to be fought, and eventually peace negotiations start to take place in the fall. Spain wanted to regain the Philippines, arguing that the war was only about Cuba, but the President of the United States refused to return the Philippines or let any other European power take them. He believed that Americans could govern the Philippines better than the Spanish had been doing. The Treaty of Paris was finalized in December of the same year. Spain agreed to recognize Cuba's independence and that America controlled Puerto Rico and Guam. In return, the United States paid Spain $20 million for the Philippines. So many argue that the Spanish ultimately lost this war, and it was the birth of the American Empire. We now had territories and various continents spread throughout the world. Not everybody agreed with this, though. There was some opposition to this empire mindset. Many prominent Americans opposed the idea of building an American empire. Some people believed that it contradicted American democratic principles and freedom. Others worried about competition from foreign workers. Some held some racist views that assimilating other races would harm the country. So, lots of upheaval, for lack of a better term. All right, let's see. So, in conclusion, after the Spanish and American War, the United States continued acquiring territories. So, this was the beginning of America expanding beyond its borders and acquiring international territories. Hawaii became a U.S. territory in 1900. Alaska became a territory in 1912. The Four-Acre Act of 1900 established Puerto Rico as an American territory with its own government, even though Puerto Ricans did not receive American citizenship until 1917. Guam and Samoa remained under U.S. Navy control. Cuba adopted a constitution based on the U.S. Constitution but remained under American influence through the Platt Amendment, which allowed the United States to interfere in Cuban affairs and maintain a naval base in Cuba. So the United States begins to transform from a regional power into a global empire. And this is going to shape how we approach the entire 20th century. Right? Positive Negative consequences? Absolutely. But it's the beginning of a major shift in American policy.